like so many other people in Kensington Community Church, I am a recovering Catholic. And I was raised Catholic in a small town. And how small was it? It was small enough that we never went to confession there because the church was so small, they only had curtains, and so we would always go to confession at my grandparents' house. And so my grandfather was actually a huge influence on me in terms of my religious upbringing. He went to church every day. His name was Raymond Porta. He was a machinist for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And by the time I was born, they had my dad when they were in their 40s. And so by the time I was born, he was retired already from the railroad. And he went to church every day. And if we played hangman, his clue was always St. Raymond. So he was just, he was really into church. So one time, well, let me just say this. When we would go to visit, we would go to their church. It was a huge church, and it was packed every Sunday that we went to visit. And my grandfather would sing, and he typically sang Ave Maria almost every time that we were there. And it wasn't until years later, I went to my first Broadway show like 13, 14 years ago, and I was with my mom and Keegan and Marie, and we went into New York City, and my mom said, "Oh, I think your grandfather lived over here." And I said, "Oh, your dad lived here?" Her dad had immigrated through Ellis Island and into New York City from Armenia. And so I thought that's who she was talking about. No, your dad's dad lived here when he was singing on Broadway.
Oh my God.
What? I had never heard that story. And he just didn't like New York City and moved back to Altoona and worked on the railroad with his dad. And he sang in church all the time, but that was it. Turns out it was packed because people were coming to see him. So, okay, never knew that. But my grandfather really was a huge influence on my kind of childhood memory of religion. I was definitely a proud and smug Catholic kid. I played CYO basketball up through 9th grade, and I was the MVP of my team, so I was really into that kind of stuff. And overall, I really had no trouble with my Catholic identity until about 11th grade. So really, there's just not a lot of questioning going on, right? I get to 11th grade, and we're in a youth group setting. We were required to go to youth group. It was not a fun thing like this. And then we got a youth group leader in 11th grade that actually made you want to come. His name was Mr. Queppet, and Mr. Queppet worked at the Tasty Cake Factory. And I'm a huge Tasty Cake fan. So Tasty Cake is a Philadelphia thing, if you guys don't know what Tasty Cakes are, but definitely butterscotch crimpets, and it just seemed like his name started with KW. It seemed like he should work at the Tasty Cake Factory. So Mr. Queppet was cool, and he invited one of the nuns to come and give us a sex ed class. Now, did I mention I was at 11th grade? 11th grade sex ed class. Okay, so the nun comes in and tells us that, masturbation is a mortal sin, extramarital sex is a mortal sin, just don't do it. And that's her sex ed talk. And if you have sex with a condom, then that puts you even further away from God, so don't do that. That would be even worse. Okay, so, he's very respectful, and she leaves, and he comes back in, and he says, okay, that was all bullshit. And we'd never heard him cuss. We'd never heard him say anything bad about the Catholic Church, ever. And he proceeded to tell us how things really were. And this is like 2 or 3 years before we ever heard of HIV or AIDS. And so it was just, the kind of normal thing to say, if you're gonna do this, use a condom. Okay, and I had so many questions, and none of them were about sex. It was really, hey, he just kind of disagreed with the nun. What's going on here? That kind of stuff. That really kind of struck a chord with all of the people in the youth group, because they all seemed like they were all on one page, all the time. And we weren't, but they were. And so that started kind of a lot of questioning. There was a little bit of other questioning going on, and that was really brought about because I had an older brother I have an older brother who is 1 year older, and he was always very sure of himself. He went to Georgetown and got a law degree. He ended up as a vice president for Georgetown University. He retired from there. Long story with that whole thing, but he was always just really comfortable with asking questions and all this kind of stuff. And after all those years with the Jesuits, he's now a practicing Quaker. And so that kind of brings me to my next little story here, and a big spiritual dilemma that sounds like it was nothing, but it actually was a big deal to me. I grew up right where Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania meet, right at the Mason-Dixon marker, like a quarter mile from that marker. And so, I have in here the story of Mason-Dixon. I'm going to skip through that. But I had a geography teacher named Mr. Rodabaugh in middle school who was the local historian who was trying to get Quaker meeting houses renovated in the area. And right up the street from me was one that had a graveyard with gravestones from like the 1500s, like the people were born in the 1500s on these headstones. And the roof was in okay shape, but the inside was pretty trashed in this meeting house. And so we would go around, this group of like 4 or 5 of us would go around with this teacher, and we would actually renovate the whole thing. We would climb on the roof and, put the shingles on, all that kind of stuff. You would not do that these days, but we did that. And this one was really close to our house. And so my brother and I would go after school, and we would, sweep it and clean the walls, clean the floors. Then we would paint. We could do all that stuff by ourselves. We would let contractors in to actually do some of the other work and that kind of stuff. And, I had the keys. I was a middle schooler with the keys to this private place. So, this was Makeout Central. So I told you, this was Makeout Central. So when it was open, it was just an open room. No big deal. Philosophically, nothing wrong with that. I was the keeper of the keys. My friends would ask me to go there, all that kind of stuff, and there was no drinking or smoking or anything like that going on there. It might have been going on elsewhere, but we didn't want any evidence, so that was not going on there. But so we started kind of putting the pews in and varnishing and staining, and it started looking more and more like a church. Okay, and then that started to feel a little wrong, and okay, so the guilt trip that I got, that whole, that goes right with the Catholicism right there, but really the part that started me questioning is this was a Quaker meeting house. So I'm Catholic. How should I feel about that? Why am I feeling guilty? Because, these people are all going to hell because, they're not in the right religion. So it just started, why am I feeling that kind of guilt? Started kind of to resonate with me. And looking back, that was actually a big deal, even though, it just seems kind of a childish thing, okay, yeah, you can forgive yourself as a child, but it just started that questioning. Let's see. So if you're like me, it's a little hard to separate spirituality and morality and religion and politics these days, that kind of thing. And I was raised by very staunchly Democratic parents in a community where it was like 2,000 Republicans and maybe 40 Democrats. And my dad was still president of the school board, and my mom was the township supervisor. So they were very, just kind of able to navigate the middle of the road pretty effectively. And, since then, my mom has definitely gone much further left, and my dad's kind of stayed in the center there. But they really raised us to see kind of racism as a thing of the past. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about that because it had a lot of impact on me through the years. So really they raised us to believe it was something that only uneducated people kind of still did, to act on their racism kind of thing, and that they really didn't know any better. And that's how kind of it was presented to us as kids. And then when I was about 11, we invited a fresh air child to our house. So this was a program where kids from New York City came to the country. I lived kind of close to Amish country, and they came to the country for a month and lived with, it was kind of an exchange program type of thing, but I wondered why, if they said it was an exchange program, didn't I get to go to the city? But so he came and stayed with us. He was about a year younger than me, maybe 2 years younger than my brother, and we had a cross burnt in the front of our yard in the middle of the night. I mean, it was KKK kind of land, and I didn't realize that. My parents knew that. But the thing that really had an impact on me was that they were not scared in the least. They were just really pissed, and that kind of ingrained an attitude that was, this is not something to be scared about. And I think that served me well through the years, just that attitude. I really had a couple of incidents like that really formed the basis of my kind of understanding of tolerance and acceptance. And so a few years after that, some teachers were invited to take students into Philadelphia and hear a speaker. And I was a total teacher's pet, so I was one of the students that got invited, and I was one of the only ones whose parents let them go. And so we, had, I think there were maybe 4 of the students and 2 teachers, and we went in there, and so I told you I played CYO basketball. We would go into Chester and Philadelphia and other places where our team and the parents would be the only white faces in the room, and that didn't faze me at all, not one bit, because it was super friendly. It was not CYO basketball is not high school basketball. It was super friendly games and camaraderie kind of thing. And so we got to Philadelphia to hear the speaker, and there were maybe 500 people there and maybe a dozen white faces. And it was Jesse Jackson. And so that's why my parents said, yeah, go, that's great. But I had no idea who he was. So we get there, and I just found it interesting. I was curious why we were amongst the few. Didn't faze me at all, though. He started to speak. It was amazing. I was totally enthralled. I'd never heard anything like it. And I can't do him. But the line that I remember the most is probably not even close to his most famous from that series of speeches, but I can vividly remember him saying to the crowd, I was only maybe 5 rows back, and him saying, it is not just your aptitude that, let's see, it's not just your aptitude, but your attitude that will determine your altitude. And I remember him saying that, going on with this kind of, you are in charge of driving your own self to where you want to go. And, it occurs to me now that he was talking to the young African-American kids in the audience and telling them, but it had a huge impact on me. Just this whole thing that you have to find the motivation in yourself, this whole idea that you have to do, one step better than everybody else. Yeah, he clearly wasn't talking to me, except he was talking to me. As a girl in science, that was totally the way it was. And I was the first girl in my Little League. I was still playing Little League, and it was totally that way. I felt like he was talking to me. And it had a huge impact on me in a lot of ways. I still, in college, would look back on that speech and play it over in my mind. So it was a big deal. Let's see. So let me say a little bit more about my parents. So my dad was a chemical engineer, my mom was a chemist, so I teach chemistry. So, this apple did not fall far from the tree, so I was not only a teacher's pet, but I totally wanted to please my parents. And my mom was only a chemist and not a chemical engineer because they would not let her at Drexel University be a chemical engineer. And in her job as a chemist, she just had a never-ending litany of harassment and just, all sorts of stories, including one where she sued the company. The ACLU put all the money behind the lawsuit, and they had a drive-by shooting on the plant, and were making death threats to all of her witnesses. So she dropped it because it just was not worth that and just, left that company. But in these days, she could pursue that a little bit more. But just given that she really wanted to be a chemical engineer, my dad seemed to love what he did, and I was good at that kind of stuff. That's what I did. I went into chemical engineering at Virginia Tech. I was there on half academic and half field hockey scholarship, so I was always into the sports, and definitely that was part of my persona growing up. So the reason I tell you that is just that spiritually, I joined varsity Christian athletes, and they would have their Bible studies, and that just did not go well. It was this self-congratulatory session on how wonderfully Christian I am with people who had been, puking sick the 2 nights earlier, and I just did not get it. I just did not get it. They were, I didn't understand the whole process, and I just went through that typical college drought in terms of spirituality. And so then from there, I got into Scripps Institution of Oceanography, came here. I had met Jay just like 3 months before leaving Virginia Tech. The Navy had sent him back to school, and he owed them 3 months for every month he was in school. So he had to work for 27 months in Patuxent River, Maryland, and then in the 28th month, we got married, and he moved out here. So, and then the Navy moved him out, and he could have been here the whole time, but he didn't know that, and we didn't know that. So, anyway, so we moved to Hillcrest, and then to Normal Heights, and we were church shopping, and he was raised Protestant. He was raised in a couple of different churches, and I was raised Catholic, so we tried 2 Catholic churches. We tried like 4 or 5 Protestant churches before we found Kensington Community Church. And we walked in here, and it was a day when they were singing Onward Christian Soldiers, and Leon Nacker was doing a Hebrew song for the offertory, and the children's moment was about how little girls and little boys can both do whatever they want to do in their lives. And then George Barber gave a sermon on religious oppression through the years, and how we had to do what we could to turn it around and all this kind of stuff. And wow, how could this be church? It was just so different than anything we'd seen in San Diego or in my upbringing. I'd never seen anything like that. And the church was really warm and welcoming, and just wonderful things going on in the church. I can remember, in that first year, meeting Mally, Gail, and Marilyn, and the Gapins, and Ken Klauber was since moved to Carlsbad, was kind of our sponsor, and Bill Crane was a big welcoming committee in and of himself. So I remember all of them just being very welcoming and inclusive, and that's another one we'd never seen, just people not, okay, we went to one church, I won't mention which church around here, and yeah, they glommed onto us because we were young and, that kind of stuff, and that was a very different feeling than being welcoming and warm. That was very different. And so we just really fell in love with the place right from the beginning. But I always felt rather apologetic about having been brainwashed by my Catholic catechism. I was just very apologetic. My only comfort there was that pretty much Jimmy Buffett felt the same way. That was it. Okay. But I was downright hostile toward Catholicism. Not toward the people at all, but toward kind of the Catholic conglomerate, and that seemed to be full of classic Christian hypocrisy. I really just did not appreciate that at all. I could not imagine to myself being openly Christian. I just could not imagine that in that day and age. And we joined in 1991, and it really wasn't until the summer of 2001 when that changed. So my spiritual journey, I feel like, really started when I walked in the doors here. And, that's why we've stayed, is because this place has had that kind of impact. So Lou Wargo in 2001 started a women's book study group. Do you remember this? So it was there that I was introduced to Marcus Borg. And we read the book, Reading the Bible Again for the first time. But the other tagline really hit me, that taking the Bible seriously, not literally. And it was there that we really started kind of discussing religion as a cultural construct. And I'd just never had that discussion before, and it was really good. Marcus Borg really intrigued me because he discussed it as that kind of social construct, and he, as much as he knew about its shortcomings, and he was Episcopalian, so the shortcomings of the Episcopal Church, he still loved it, warts and all, and he still had an appreciation for it and could really put that into words. And I'd always been skeptical of facts in the Bible, and he really laid it out, that when you're searching for facts, you're missing the entire point. What the Bible is about is truths, not facts. And that, made so much more sense. So just understanding that whole social context of the Bible, really putting it into a religion being more about a community of faith and less about checking the boxes and saying the right prayers and doing the right kind of atonement and that sort of thing. And that really started to resonate with me. Then something happened that really changed the way that I view my faith. I went to teach at Catalina Island that fall. I was on sabbatical, and Jay got Keegan off to kindergarten for the first day, and then a week later, Marie off to preschool for the first day, and I was teaching 14 CSU students at Catalina Island, and we lived in the dorms together. It was just me and them and the guy who ran the cafeteria, and that was it. And I had a teaching assistant who was about 24 years old, and on about a week and a half into it, 9/11 happened. So we're on island. We cannot get off the island. All transportation is shut down for 4 or 5 days. We have spotty cell service, and so you only have cell service from that facility. So we are really just watching TV and not knowing what to do. My students are all over the map, from raging in anger to just weeping constantly. It was really tough. We did have email, and it was early generation email, but it was email, and I could communicate with the people from my campus. And I talked to our counselor, I talked to some of my friends who are in psychology, and one particular friend in education, and we talked about, well, what do I do? Because, we were scuba diving and snorkeling every day. We could not do that, not in the state of mind that they were in. So they really thought I needed to have a religious service, some kind of memorial service in order to move on. So that Friday night, we scheduled it on the pier, and I led a service. And I gave a sermon on free will and what that means. and I, led them in Amazing Grace, and I said, well, I'll let you choose. We can either sing America the Beautiful or the Star-Spangled Banner. And one girl just falls on the ground crying because she said, I'm such a bad American, I don't know the words to either song. And it was just that kind of thing. So we went around and talked about what emotions we were feeling, and these guys who were just the ones who carried the 2 scuba tanks down to the water for us, those guys were just eaten up inside. They were like, is there going to be a draft? Am I going to have to go to war? What's going on? All this kind of stuff. And that service just did it. Everybody the next morning woke up and we all went snorkeling, and we all just, did some kayaking and did all these things together, and it just worked. I could never have done that. I really could never have done that without that summer that really convinced me that I really was Christian. That foundation from George Barber's sermons and Lou Wargo's sermons and just the kind of discussions with the people in this church, that's what allowed me to do that. And I just felt like, I've never been a believer in fate or predetermination, but I felt like everything here was connected. I think we learn something from every experience, and we apply that the next time we see something where that applies. Whether it's conscious or subconscious level, I think that happens. And, I've always been good at learning. In fact, I've been good at learning in just the way our schools award it. Just the way that our society, up until the current administration, valued. I was good at that. I had an eidetic memory for numbers. So my high school psychology class, I had to do some kind of project. I came in and memorized the phone numbers for every student in the class. There were 40 kids. They told me their phone number. I said it back to them, went to the next person, next person, next person. They took me out in the hall, scrambled the kids, came back in. I recited every single one of them to them. Okay, I could remember numbers. Nowadays, somebody cuts me off in traffic, I will remember their license plate for 2 weeks. Okay, that's how it works. I can't consciously will myself to remember numbers anymore, and it drives me nuts. But so I was really good at that kind of stuff. The professor said it once, I remembered it. I got my PhD, I did a type of teaching postdoc at Tulane, then I went back to UCSD, because New Orleans is like the definition of a great place to visit, but you don't want to live there. And so I came back here and could have stayed there, but I found a position at Cal State San Marcos and absolutely loved teaching there. The school was just starting, so I had more opportunities than most to participate in kind of governance and structuring the school than most junior faculty do. So I was chair of the Student Affairs Committee when we decided on colors and on mascot and that kind of stuff. That was the most interesting debate ever. Other than, do we bring a Starbucks to campus or not? That was even more heated. But there were really, let me see where I am here. And so there were typically about 5 people on each committee, but it really felt like only 2 or 3 did the work, and I thought the others were just, not doing the work or didn't have the time. Everybody was into it, so it wasn't like they were lazy. Nobody was there because they were lazy. It was not that kind of thing. But I couldn't figure out why they didn't do that, kind of didn't do the writing initially. And I eventually figured it out that, some disciplines don't criticize each other on a regular basis and don't take criticism as well as other disciplines. In the sciences, they're constantly debating things. It turns out there were a lot of other disciplines like that, so like literature is actually the closest to a lot of the sciences in terms of the discussions that they have and how critical they are of one another, so the way they would discuss things was really similar. Is that me dinging? I hope not. No, it's not. Let's see. So I would just really write something to get that down on paper for these committees, and then everybody was really good at bringing their edits. You know, they would read it and bring their edits with no problems. So I learned to completely abandon my ego in terms of just getting something down on paper for first drafts. And like I said in the intro to the talk, it's because the urge to edit is much stronger than the urge to create. So that it was no problem for me. I could recognize good ideas and take them in, flesh them out kind of thing, and then just get it down and let people do what they wanted with it and not have it kind of be tied to my ego. And that was really great. I thought I had this job down until a couple years into it. We had a speaker who was working on some theories of learning styles. He came to Cal State San Marcos, the faculty center brought him in, and every single faculty member on campus at that time, because we only had 45, we all came together, maybe 2 missed it, and had this speaker. Well, there were 45 of us, okay, and we had to take a survey that didn't seem to have anything to do with learning styles, and then he had 30 students who took this survey. He had paid them $10 each and just grabbed them off of the sidewalk. So they were just kind of a random sampling of our students. And if it had been a Friday, they would have been all science majors, but it wasn't a Friday, so that wasn't the case. But so when he graded all of our quizzes, or we graded all of our quizzes, all but 2 of the faculty ended up in one quadrant that he had put up there. And only like 4% of the population learned like they learned. And all of us were in there. Every single student was in this other one. You know, the 2 were in this oddball category, 1%. And what's funny is they were from 2 really different disciplines, and I served on committees with them, and I couldn't figure out why they seemed so similar. And now I knew. So we called them schlep rocks. So they were just kind of always pessimists, and that came through. Okay, so this other quadrant, that's where 80% of the population is. Guess who we are teaching? We are teaching that 80% of the population. Up until then, I always thought you teach to yourself. You know, well, what would I have liked when I was going through school? That's how I wrote my lectures, you know? That's how you did it. Yeah, okay. But these students learn very differently than I do. I could learn however it was presented to me. They had one dominant learning style, and they really needed to see something in a style that they could digest. So this was a shock, because I had been, you know, thinking I was a really great teacher all this time, and I knew there was something missing, but I didn't know what it was. You know, I just could tell, but it was super humbling. So I had to learn about teaching, and that's really kind of started me down this path where I took a lot of kind of workshop classes on how to teach science. And the thing is, it's not just about teaching science, it's about reaching the students, right? And so we've had a lot of workshops that the church could sponsor. I mean, we've had a lot of workshops that really border right on that spiritual kind of connection. And one of those is this concept of cultural intelligence. Like, what is motivating the students to learn, and what is keeping them from learning in your class? And one of those barriers is actually when they feel like they don't have a spiritual connection with you, they don't have any understanding of you in that sense. And so just one story about that, and that is that the day after Trump was elected, I came into the classroom, and there was a guy literally with the Make America Great t-shirt on, telling students in the front row that they did not belong in this classroom. And I walked in, and he clammed up and sat down, and the people in front, noticed that was the day I wore my cross. I never wore a cross to work, but that day I wore my cross. 3 students came up to me and said, until you wore that cross necklace, I thought you were Jewish. And another one said, I thought you were Muslim, and she was Muslim. I thought you were Muslim with the things that you said and, all this kind of stuff. Really interesting that they never pegged me as a Christian. And also really interesting that I thought that was a great thing. Outside of class, no problem. Inside of class, the more you can form a connection with them, the better. I was forming connections without knowing it, where people thought I was their own religion. Well, that's a good thing. How do I do that consciously? And I've thought a lot about that in the past year, is how do I actually do that consciously? Let people know that I feel connected to them, and maybe it's spiritual and maybe it's not, but without without lying or anything like that. But I thought that was very, very interesting. So let's see. So it's been really interesting to learn that I'm good at I was good at being a student because the system was geared toward me. It was really geared toward me. But being a good teacher takes a lot more effort, and connecting with the students takes even more effort than that. And that, I don't know, that has been part of my spiritual journey since that day on September 11th. Because I felt so close to that class, like we still keep in touch. Those 14 students, I'm still in touch with 13 of them. So that class has helped me through a lot of why were we so close, and how that helped them through the years, that kind of stuff. So it was a spiritual connection. Let's see. So So now I constantly ask students how they learn. I ask them for insights into what allowed them to learn a certain topic effectively. And I try to apply it to life and certainly to spirituality. But I still feel like I've been skating on the surface, and there's a whole lot of stuff going on underneath the water there, underneath the ice there. So I look at effective people and I wonder how they view religion and life in general. And what I see now that I look back is that small things that people do mean a lot. There are too many everyday heroes in here. I actually name all of my book group as definitely people who have been heroes for me. I was named Kay Marie before she came in as somebody who was also just had a big impact on me in little things that she does. But I do want to point out one, and that is that one of my big spiritual crises of late was when Marg and Daryl were literally there, and the rest of you were spiritually there, when Marie was struggling with hopelessness and depression and ended up in Radies for 8 days. During that time, we went to see her every single day, sometimes twice a day when we were allowed, but most of the kids there had no visitors. And the reason they had no visitors was because they had tried to kill themselves after coming out to their parents or their family and having not only no emotional support, but being kicked out of their houses, that kind of thing. And that really made me think long and hard about how I would react, or how my parents would have reacted and how I would have wanted them to react if that had happened to me. And lo and behold, Keegan came out to me last summer as transgender, and I tried to remember what I had thought about. It was hard to remember what I had thought about, but I could remember a lot of those emotions, and I tried to react in a way that was the most loving I could muster. And that was actually to tell him, I loved him and I appreciated that this was going to be very difficult for him and that it was already very difficult for him, but that it was just not a big deal to me and not going to keep me up at nights and that kind of thing. I thought I would want my parents to react in a way that's like, yeah, well, you're you. And so I tried to react that way in a way that also says, but I'm there for you. and so just, I feel like those things were really connected. And I also felt like I could look to this congregation and see so many models of caring and support. And I really did look. I looked at Jody and just exactly how does she support her kids, and other people in the community here. And I said, just, okay, what do they do? What works? What doesn't? That kind of thing. And it's been super helpful. I found truly loving and caring everywhere I turn in this congregation. So it's meant so much to me, not just in that whole spiritual journey, but in the foundation that I've found and the support that I've found here. I feel like, in this way, I don't have a lot of new ideas. I really build on ideas that I see around me. And so my point here is that you really might not know when somebody's watching. And that's how people behave in here, that they don't care if people are watching, they behave in a really loving and caring way. I went to a talk last week where a math historian left with a quote that he attributed to a rare moment of humility for Sir Isaac Newton, and it was, "If I have seen farther, it is because I stood on the shoulders of giants." And you here are all my giants. And I maybe wouldn't have put it that way. I would have discussed it in a little more of the way that I heard Jane Goodall put it. And I have a love of nature that I share with a lot of you, and definitely with Jay and Marie, but especially with Keegan. And Keegan and I got to meet, we all got to meet Jane Goodall back in 2004, and then in 2006, Keegan and I got to go to a very small group and meet her again. And she told this story about how the birds were having a competition. Some of you may have heard this before, but they were having a competition to see who could fly the highest. And the eagle flew higher than everyone else, right? The eagle gets up there and looks down and it's all like, yeah, I am the best. And then just gets a little bit melancholy because, nobody else can see this view that he has. And then he feels a little ruffle of feathers. And out comes this little wren that had been hitchhiking the whole time. And the wren starts chirping and going higher and higher, and the eagle is exhausted and can't go any higher. And the wren goes the highest. And they get back down, and I think Jane Goodall's going to say, in your face, eagle, something along those lines, or, the eagle's really mad, that kind of thing. And instead, the moral lesson was that the eagle was expressing a little bit of being bummed that he had been beaten. And the wren looked at the eagle and said, "No, don't you see that you have no reason to feel sad? Because of you, birds today have flown higher than they ever have before." And that was kind of the moral of the story. And I really feel like every day, you and I are eagles to someone else in our lives. A lot of times we might not even know it. What my faith has taught me is that connections are there. We are all connected. We're all watching one another. We're all helping one another all the time, or beating each other down subconsciously without even knowing it. And so, I just feel like we have to see those connections, because sometimes they're hiding in our feathers. And so I leave you tonight with a challenge to see those places where other people lift you up and where you are standing squarely on their shoulders.